By mid-morning of the following day, Neil's midnight romance had become unreal. Reality was upon him in the form of a crowded wheelhouse and 30-knot winds out of the east-southeast. A little after dawn, Jean had gotten up to prepare the watch of Frank and Tony a breakfast, and had given Neil a polite, perhaps warm smile, but with no more apparent passion in it than the one she gave to Frank. After breakfast, he and Frank had listened to another appalling news summary. Refugees were flooding southward all over the world and being resented and rebuffed by the local populations in the traditional ways of treating war refugees. Cuba, the Panama Canal, and the Venezuelan oil fields and refineries had all been struck by some sort of nuclear weapon. The Caribbean too would be a disaster area. It wasn't even clear who had attacked Venezuela, since she, like all the rest of South America, had loudly declared a neutrality and was refusing to sell oil to the United States. And later, at 8 a.m, with the wind now beginning to screech through the stainless steel rigging and Tony cracking a rib in a fall while trying to bring in a torn jib, reality had regained its usual harshness. In the crowded wheelhouse, under an overcast and darkening sky, Skippy was whining about the taste of fish. Lisa had just vomited up her breakfast on the wheelhouse floor, and Jean, feeling queasy herself, was trying to deal with them. For Neil, battling at the helm, there was no room for romance with a torn jib, an injured crewman, rising winds and seas, and Frank and Tony arguing with him about the course. By dead reckoning from their noon position of the day before, Neil calculated they were about 100 miles east-southeast of Cape Lookout, North Carolina, a spit of land that tipped the long sand barrier that stretched south of the notorious Cape Hatteras. Without consulting the others, Neil had been maintaining a southerly course, partly because he was considering a run to the Bahamas and the West Indies rather than trying to put in again on the mainland. Frank had complained the previous afternoon that they seemed to be staying unnecessarily far off the coast, and suggested they angle more to the westward. Now, with large angry swells sweeping up against them from the south and the wind still rising, a choice was being forced upon him. They could either continue to work their way south, or they could turn and run back toward land. They had been unable to pick up a radio station in the Moorhead City, Pamlico South area of North Carolina, and they had no way of knowing what conditions would be like there. Reports from the Bahamas about the West Indies were discouraging. The Bahamian government had declared a state of emergency and martial law, warning Bahamians that food imports on which they were dependent for more than 80% of their normal supply had been cut off by the war. Foreign ships, by which Neil knew they meant American ships, were urged to go elsewhere. After panic buying had eliminated most of the island's stores of food, the Bahamians were not welcoming the sudden influx of sick, injured, and foodless Americans fleeing from the two nuclear explosions over Miami and Cape Canaveral. There had been at least one ugly racial incident already, or so Neil concluded from Radio Nassau's report on that 5 American yachtsmen had been killed by several unapprehended black Bahamians in a street fight. If Vagabond had to bypass the Bahamas, they would run desperately short of food and water before they could hope to reach Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands. Jim and Lisa's success the last 2 mornings at hooking 3 big fish were encouraging, but they were in the Gulf Stream now. If they continued south, in another day or two they'd be east of it, and the fishing less dependable. As the wind freshened and the storm clouds gathered on the southern horizon with like thick black smoke, Neil had to admit that he was also worried about Vagabond. She was badly overloaded. A good trimaran normally sails faster than a good monohull because of its light weight, which permits it to skip over the water rather than plough through it. But Vagabond was now almost 2,000 pounds heavier than the ship that they had sailed north, and was moving 2 or 3 knots slower, which made her pound heavily into the huge seas that were rolling at her. Although altering course to run before the storm would put an end to this slamming, which was the greatest source of anxiety for Neil and discomfort for the crew, Neil knew that even then the buffeting of the wind and the seas would continue to drain the energy from everyone on board. In his own experience, 35-knot winds and 12-foot seas were bearable, but for most of the others they represented a danger far more immediate, palpable, and unpleasant than anything on the mainland. Everyone was seasick except Neil, Tony, and Elaine. And since none of them were the type to go cleaning up after other people's messes, most of the cabins were beginning to stink of vomit. With Seth's bullet wounds, Tony's cracked rib, and the general seasickness, the crew was considerably weakened. But despite the problems, he hated the thought of turning back towards the fallout and the explosions and the people evil of the land. A storm at sea was something he could deal with. The effects of man's madness on land were not. As he made the rounds of the ship before meeting with Frank, Tony and Macklin to discuss their course, he knew that to continue southward against these seas would create serious morale problems. It might be exhilarating to escape from explosions, pirates and radioactive fallout, but with those dangers now distant and remote, the endless slamming, the awful whine of the wind in the rigging, the woeful roll, pitch and plunge of the trimaran, the seasickness, and worst of all, he knew, no indication of any safer haven to the south than to the west, was depressing most of the ship's company. Only Elaine and Tony had complained directly, but the averted gaze of Jean and the sardonic humour of Frank and Seth revealed similar feelings. He, Tony, Frank and Ollie gathered around the dinette table at 11:30 that morning, the four of them swaying and bumping in their seats as Vagabond plunged and smashed forward through the huge seas. Jim was at the helm, while an almost useless Conrad Macklin sat miserably on the little seat in the corner of the cabin. Everyone else was below in a berth. Frank, pale and weak from vomiting, and Tony, seeming as energetic and healthy as ever, had both been urging Neil to change course for several hours. Even before they could begin their discussion, Vagabond struck a big roller with a savage smash that spilled silverware out of a drawer and toppled half a dozen books out of the dinette bookcase. Neil immediately went up on deck and instructed Jim to bring Vagabond around 90 degrees to head due west while they had their discussion. As he watched and instructed Lisa in adjusting the sheets of the storm jib and the double-reefed mainsail, Neil felt immediately how much easier the motion of the boat became. Vagabond now began surfing along and down the big swells instead of having to plough through them, and although the noise of the water and the wind was scarcely diminished, the actual strain on the boat had probably been halved. When Neil returned to the main cabin, Frank and Tony looked pleased. "What a different feeling," Tony announced triumphantly. "Thank God we didn't wreck poor Vagabond before we changed course." "Yes," Neil commented dryly. "How lucky." "Are we going to hold course back to land?" Frank asked. "Not necessarily. That's a decision I decided should be made by the four ship's officers," Neil replied. "What about the rest of us?" Tony interjected. "Don't Seth and me and Jean count for anything?" "That's right," said Frank. "I'm not sure it's fair not to include all the adults." Neil glanced at Ollie, who was leaning back with his eyes closed, holding an unlit pipe in his mouth, and at Tony, also sitting opposite him, who was flushed with excitement. "Are you prepared, Frank?" Neil countered, if outvoted by Tony, Seth, Macklin and Elaine, to surrender the ship's fate to a majority decision. Rubbing his big hands in front of him, his face sweaty from seasickness, Frank scowled. "No, I guess not," he answered slowly. "We should consult with everybody, but the decision should be made by the four officers." He didn't look up at Tony. "Well, Tony," Neil said neutrally to Tony, who had flushed at Frank's decision, "what do you advise?" "You know what I advise," Tony answered angrily. "That we stop beating our brains out and get back to land. You promised us in the chief's state that we'd be landing back on the US coast. You can't go back on that." "Would you feel that way if we began to run into fallout?" "Of course not," Tony snapped back. "But we should try to get back, especially when the damn boat is being smashed to pieces." "Frank?" Neil asked quietly. "We should run before the storm and get back to land," he said, again not looking up. "Ollie?" "Whatever you want, Cap. It's all right by me," Captain Ollie replied promptly, without even bothering to open his eyes. "I like it out here, but if you feel we ought to go and load a few landlubbers, it's okay by me." Neil smiled and stood up. "I'll go and consult the others," he said. 5 minutes later he returned. "Jim and Seth say they'd rather I decided," Neil announced quietly, as he resumed his seat opposite a now dozing Captain Ollie. "What the fuck is this shit?" Tony exploded. "You got everybody but me and Frank under your thumb?" "Oh, I doubt it," Neil replied. "I'm sure that if Macklin here had the strength to comment, he'd want to return to land." "You're damn right," Tony said. "And what about Elaine?" "She was sleeping, but I'm sure she'd vote the way you do." "You're damn right." "And Jean?" Frank asked softly. Jean's vote would have been decisive for Neil, but fortunately or unfortunately, she had been as ambivalent as Neil himself. She was miserable with seasickness, her own and Skippy's, and frightened of the crashes of the waves against the seemingly flimsy plywood of the hull. But she had first joked by urging Neil to take me away from it all, and to take me some place where I can die in peace. But just before he left, she had clutched his arm and said earnestly, "You've saved me and my children twice already. I'd be a fool to question how you plan to do it a third time." "Jean essentially left it up to me also," Neil answered finally. "None of this proxy shit," Tony persisted. "The fact is, most of those with minds of their own know we ought to be getting back to the mainland." Frank votes your way and Jim and Ollie abstain. Neil went on quietly. My personal decision. I insist you can consult the others, Tony interrupted. My personal decision, Neil went on, is that we continue on a course too close to the mainland until the weather moderates or we encounter the danger of radioactive fallout. It's only fair that... What? Tony said, taken aback by Neil's decision. Frank, when you and Tony go on duty an hour from now, Neil said, turning to his friend beside him, try the transistor radio every hour to pick up news about conditions along the North Carolina coast. Fine, said Frank. We're about 100 miles off the coast now, Neil continued. At this rate we'll close with the coast during the night. We've got to find out if the big navigational lights are in operation. They've got emergency generators, Frank said. I know. They should be working. However, I'd prefer not to sail onto the Hatteras or the Lookout Shoals to find out they're not. We're going back to the mainland? Tony asked, still adjusting to his unexpected victory. If the mainland will have us, Neil replied, rising again. I'm going to check with the shortwave to see if we can find out more about this storm. See you later. After Neil left, Ollie announced he was going to take a nap and went forward to lie down. Frank poured himself and Tony a tiny amount of whiskey and water and sat down again. Well, we won that one, Tony said. Startled, Frank looked up at him. I think Neil realises, Tony went on, that he can't run this boat without our support. He made himself captain, but in effect we have veto power. Frank sipped his drink. And I want you to know, Frank, Tony went on, leaning forward and putting one of his hands on Frank's arm, that if push ever comes to shove, I'm behind you 100%. You understand? Frank stared at his drink. 100%, Tony repeated, standing up. As far as I'm concerned, you already are the captain. He paused, staring down at Frank, who didn't look up. When Vagabond surfed down a big wave, Tony staggered forward, steadying himself against the wall behind Frank. I've got to take a piss, he concluded, and disappeared into the small head located opposite the stove. Frank stared at his drink another 10 seconds, then, grimacing, tossed the rest of it off. The grimace continued until, looking sick and swearing irritably under his breath, he went hurriedly up the hatchway steps for fresh air. When Tony came out of the head, Conrad Macklin was seated at the dinette and poured himself a shot of whiskey. Tony sat down opposite him. I thought you were too sick to drink, Tony said. I'm only too sick to stand watch, Macklin answered indifferently, looking coolly at Tony and pouring the other man a drink. You hear what I said to Frank? Tony asked, holding his plastic cup of whiskey. Macklin nodded and took a short swig from his cup. But you know, Tony, he said after a short silence, Frank will never be the captain of this ship. No, said Tony, studying the bottle when it slid a few inches after Vagabond surfed along the face of a wave. He'll be dead in a month, said Macklin. And besides, he hasn't got the guts to be captain. Well, all I know is that Loken makes like a dictator. Macklin nodded and sipped gingerly again at his drink, his round eyes examining Tony with that expression. Sooner or later, Tony, he went on softly, he's going to kick you and me off the boat. Tony looked up quickly. You, maybe, he cowered, but why me? I'm as good a sailor as he is, maybe better. Macklin smiled and nodded meaningfully. That's exactly why he has to get rid of you, he said to Tony. He knows you're the only other man aboard with captain potential. Tony looked at Macklin uncertainly, the sway of the kerosene lantern creating shadows that made it difficult to decipher Macklin's expression. Sooner or later, Macklin went on softly, either you'll get kicked off or you and I will have to take over the boat. No one's kicking me off anything, Tony snapped back. That's right, Tony, Macklin replied, nodding. That's right. Macklin held his half-filled cup towards Tony, and after a pause, Tony understood. The two men clicked their cups together and drank.